But if you can think correctly and group and identify the classes of issues, then you can multiply the effect you get by fixing just one issue into, well, how do we fix an entire class of issues across the company?
There he is.
Joel, hey, good afternoon.
Dude, it's so good to see you again, my friend.
Yeah, man, you are rocking that beard. That is very different than the last time we spoke.
I've been living in the mountains.
Excellent. Something new for, well, it's been an interesting year, right? So that's, anyway, I'm glad to see you again, right? And I'm very gratified. I think when we spoke, it was more than 2 years ago, right? And you'd done kind of the high double-digit podcast. Now you're well into the triple digits, over 300. So I'm really glad to see you've maintained an engaging stream of content with world-class speakers.
Yeah, thanks to you, my friend, like for coming on and talking. That really helped a lot. And your episode was super popular. I got a lot of feedback from it. You gave some great leadership insight, and so I'm just really grateful that to know you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, because I was just we covered a lot of ground last time.
We did.
Right?
We didn't cover your background story though. Really, like how you, as a kid, got into technology. I don't think we went there.
We can do so, right?
Yeah.
And certainly happy to cover anything from last time we want to expand on. And obviously, the world has changed, significantly over any, 2 3 year time period, and particularly in the last year.
So what's been going on this past year for you?
Yeah, I think and at this point, we both had many conversations. So I think there's certainly a lot of commonality about, and it's interesting timing because we're just past the 1 year mark when the U.S. really started to shut down, right? Kind of in mid-March of last year. And so I think we've learned a lot about ourselves in terms of resiliency and what is possible or what is not. And I think a common theme really is that a lot of things that people didn't think was possible or the speed really turned out to be possible, and it was really just the having a burning platform, so to speak, to make a lot of the changes. Right? And so I think that's the first order effect. And then because interestingly enough, 1 year on, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the future looks like. And so as that emerges, it'll be interesting to see, what second order effects or what other factors come into play as hopefully we see some light and optimism at the end of the tunnel to emerge into what might be called post-COVID or post-pandemic.
How was it? I know you get to travel all over the world, and I know you have family all over the world. How was it? Did you get separated from your family during COVID? How did that play out for you?
Yeah, so the timing was interesting. I was in China on a business trip right before 2020's Lunar New Year. So already then there had been some initial and early coverage about the spread of what was then novel coronavirus before it became formally known as COVID-19. And as soon as I came back from that trip, the Lunar New Year started and China shut down. Right? And then in February, the rest of the world was still trying to find its footing and seeing if this was serious. And so I continued on some more business trips within the US in February, right up until basically the US declared that, we were shutting down as well. Luckily, I was able to stay with my family. Right? We're still in California. And from then on, it's been long blocks of working remotely, right? As I think probably you have been as well. Interestingly, towards the end of last year, I did carve out time to spend a few months in China. And so that was just a fascinating contrast with, how we had been living under lockdown or near shutdown conditions for many months at that time versus being in China, right, which was, in terms of daily life, much more normal than it was in other parts of the world.
Are autonomous vehicles more popular over there?
I think it's certainly an active area of investment. I think electric vehicles certainly are gaining mind share. But again, in most places, I would characterize it as electric vehicles are very popular, but a lot of the settings in which it needs to work, right? It's probably similar in terms of adoption. Right? There's a lot of research, a lot of interest, but it's nowhere near the, kind of the so-called level 5 hands-off. You don't really need a driver in the driver's seat. So I think there's equal interest. And for example, even companies like Baidu, right? They're looking to go international and expand their footprint with autonomous driving. But the technology is still under investment. And it's, I'd say we're still a fair ways away. So you definitely don't see kind of, I think there's certainly interesting trials just as there are in the US, but there's certainly nothing at scale where you have fleets and entire fleets of cars that are entirely autonomous yet.
I did see an article that showed it was in China, and it showed a small autonomous vehicle that was KFC. It was like the restaurant KFC, and they had these meals, and you could walk up and you could order from this autonomous vehicle and then take the meal out. And I said, that's unbelievable. They have autonomous KFC vehicles. That's out of this world.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because broadly for technology, it tends to be easy to do kind of the one-off or the interesting science experiment, right? And then so that's the question, which is, let's put it the other way. We flip it. I don't believe they would say we're going to close 90% of KFC stores and you just walk up to a KFC autonomous car at this point, right? So certainly the technology there as a proof of concept, there's a lot of interesting things you can do, and then the question is how do you scale that up? And sometimes what we see is that you can do an interesting, almost PR like, hey, check this out of what we can do, 1, 10, 15 vehicles. And then over time will tell if they continue to make the investment and if, how they want to complement their existing retail formats with that.
Yeah, I didn't dig too deep. It could have just been like in a closed business complex, a PR move. And I was actually reading a lot of the news about Lenovo before like 10 minutes ago. I was just sitting there on Google scanning through the news. I'm like, oh, I wonder if there's some interesting questions in here to talk about with Art. And then as I got to like page 4 of the results, was just content posted in the past like 2 days. There's so much content that's coming out of Lenovo, and you're like a face for Lenovo, right? So how do you keep up with it, or how do you handle when people are asking you things? I mean, you can't see every news story that comes out.
Yep. No, so luckily we have I think we have high alignment around our strategy, right? And so hopefully what you've been seeing has been largely reflecting of where we're going as a company. Because you're right, it's impossible for any leader to know all the details, right? That would just be literally inhuman to have that kind of memory or attention span. But I think it goes back to having clear thematic elements around the story that we're telling about what we're doing. And last time we talked about, right, we were earlier down the road and now we're much farther. And we've really coalesced and solidified the strategy around our transformation, right, which is going to be the intelligent transformation and also a services-led transformation. And so all the stories that you see, hopefully, and you can let me know differently, but right, it's really around our strategy of moving away and moving towards much more customer centricity, offering services and solutions, right? Because the world continues to get more complex. There's a lot of pace of change with technologies. And so how do we offer, right, in this new world of edge to cloud and client to cloud, where along the way, you need to integrate a lot of assets to make a meaningful solution for businesses. Right? Lenovo is well positioned from right client devices to edge computing to cloud to hybrid cloud management and also intelligence. And so it's really around the themes that we spend a lot of time helping our customers as well as the public understand what it is that we're trying to do. So that helps, right? When you can anchor on some of the themes that we are working on, then it becomes much easier. And hopefully we're not spreading our efforts too thinly in terms of communicating all different things, but it's really around some of the themes in our services transformation.
How do those themes come about?
So the themes come about, I think it's a combination of multiple streams of thought, right? One obviously is keeping up in the industry. And here clearly, and I think at this point it's been more than 10 years since Mark Andreessen's famous "Software is Eating the World" editorial came out. But that's continued to come true, right? A lot of the profit pools, a lot of the industry dynamics are shifting into the software layer, right? So we have within Lenovo around a long-term technology outlook where we look at the macro picture of what's changing. And so that is a constant output, as well as consideration for how do we think about the technology trends that are going to be relevant to our business and where are the next opportunities. Right? And the second one is we spend a lot of time listening and engaging with our customers, right? Whether they're consumers, right? We're able to engage with them more and more. And then we hold a variety of advisory councils, right? Whether that's with our partners, our suppliers, or our large enterprise customers. And they represent really valuable feedback. And when we listen to them, there's also a strong pull for integration and services and solution, right? There's a lot less interest. And I can even tell from my view as a CIO, right? It's not very, if you want to come talk to me and you want to sell me a box or an appliance, right? Or a piece of kit, it's not really compelling, right? What's compelling is if you can tell me a value proposition about how that's going to make me more successful in something that I'm looking for. Right? Maybe it's code quality, right? Maybe it's engineering maturity, right? Maybe it's turnaround time and agility. Whatever it is, that's the way to get my attention. And I don't think I'm an exception. When we listen to our customers, that's increasingly what they're asking for as well. So by looking and staying closely engaged with the market, right, the technology, as well as our customers, I think those form the key inputs for when we brainstorm, where are we today? And then where should we go next, right? At the nexus of those forces is where the conversation gets interesting and starts generating some of the outputs.
Well, the best thing in the world is when you're experiencing a problem running your business and you go and you find that there's a mature solution that does exactly what you need and you can just purchase it and then move on to the next problem.
Yes, exactly. And it's interesting because I think there's a lot of, obviously there's a very healthy startup community and a lot of enterprise, a lot of companies and startups, both in China, in the US, as well as elsewhere. And I think one of the good things that technology has made possible is really the elimination or the significant reduction of boundaries, right? Meaning that it's easy to start these companies up, it's easy to discover. With the rise of software as a service, it's also easy to try a lot of these things with fairly low friction. And that makes the experimentation. I know last time we talked about, right, well, how do you make better experiments, right? How do you make better decisions? And if you're going to make a mistake, let's, at least make new mistakes that are treading new ground and generating new learnings. And so I think we continue to see technology reducing the entry costs for companies, as well as testing out the adoption of those technologies, which is quite positive.
Yeah, we try. One of the things I was actually thinking about this weekend, I wasn't sure like who I would ask this question to, but it was just running around in my mind. It's that I try not to make the same mistake twice, right? That's a goal for me. But I'm human, right? I'm not perfect. And so it happens, right? Sometimes I'll find myself making the same mistake and that'll create a pressure for me to change. And so I'm curious, in your experience, what's a mistake that you found yourself making over and over and then you finally were like, I'm done. I've had it. I'm never repeating this mistake again.
Yeah. Well, and that's a fascinating question, right? Because I think it goes back into the level of abstraction that you think about. And what I mean by that is, right, a mistake, you're very unlikely, if you're at all thoughtful, to repeat an exact mistake, right? The same situation, right? The same context, the same system. But where I find, right, I'd like to move faster, and I've been working with my team on how to identify patterns are really the patterns, right? How do we find classes of mistakes that really might have more similar root causes? So let me give you an example, right? So for a while, that we went through a period where we were having higher production level incidents that were causing significant impacts to the business, right? We might not be able to ship, maybe we couldn't answer the call center in a region for a time, right? Maybe our manufacturing line went down at a critical moment. And we have a process within Lenovo called Fu Pan, right? But that's literally a kind of a metaphor of replaying the board of chess. It's a retrospective in a sense that goes very deep on the root causes. And what I found is we would go very deep on what I would call the proximate cause, right? The teams were excellent about firefighting to say, okay, well, for example, in this case, the hardware had a failure, and we just had a single node setup. And so, how do we fix that? Okay, well, we should make it a high availability setup. Right? In another case, it might be, well, the high availability didn't work the way we thought it would work. Right? So even if we had high availability, it didn't cut over the way we thought. And so what was happening is we were getting deep on a particular problem, a slice of a problem, but we weren't necessarily taking that and trying to expand it to say, what is the class of failures? Right? So for example, if right, hardware failing, right? The one, 1 week it was, well, the server failed. The other was, right, the storage failed, right? The third was like the firmware and the controller node failed. And we were treating them as separate things, right? It's like, okay, well, if the firmware level fails, let's do this, right? If the storage fails, let's do this, right? If the network interface card on this port fails, let's do this. And while those were all right, addressing that very narrow proximate cause, what we were missing was, well, guys, why don't we step back and think and put on our hat of, we keep seeing different types of these failures, right? But they're all related to some kind of hardware failure, right? Somewhere in the stack. And it doesn't matter if it was the storage, if it was the disk, right? If it was the motherboard, if it was an IC, like a 50-cent IC somewhere else on the chip. The broader problem to solve is, how do we solve and how do we tolerate kind of arbitrary hardware failure, right? And so if you put your hat on that way, then you can reorient yourself and think differently. It's not, well, let me just think about it very technical. It's actually, there's an entire discipline around this, around SRE and site reliability engineering, right? And how you engineer, assuming that there's going to be failure at different points, right? And then there's techniques and patterns that you can adopt to go fix that. So I would, not so much as mistakes, but I think the mental framing we took was too narrow, right? In a way that forces, I would say, not to repeat mistakes, but for not stepping quickly enough to identify the synthesis to say, hey, look, there's a broader way of looking at this. And when you look at it more broadly, you don't have to be down, you do have to be down in the nuts and bolts to fix the proximate issue. But if you can think correctly and group and identify the classes of issues, then you can multiply the effect you get by fixing just one issue into, well, how do we fix an entire class of issues across the company?
That's brilliant. That's you say stuff sometimes, Art, and I'm just like, my mind is just so focused on what you're saying. I'm not even thinking of like another question. I'm just like, I'm taking notes. It's great.
And I think it's not me, it's the team, right? I think that's part of the value of dialogue, right? Which is, as a leader, you're constantly thinking, what else is at stake, right? Because you're not going to be the person who's best fit to diagnose, well, what's wrong with the firmware version, and how many patch levels am I away? Am I n-1 or n-2, right? The teams are going to be on top of that, and so a lot of the value add is really thinking with the team about, right, these right mental models, right? Are we thinking about it the right way? And so, for example, right, it was like a light bulb for the team. It's like, well, what, instead of laboring every time when a production issue comes up, like this whole class of issues we should bring, right? And there's a whole body of work, right? This is the whole point of, how do you share knowledge, and how do you, again, to your point, not make the same mistake twice? You can draw on people who are way smarter and at different scales than you and have done different variations to accelerate your journey. So the next time you're confronting something new, it's really net new that you can spend your brain cycles on.
So the result of those issues was site reliability engineering.
Well, it was introducing elements of that, right? Because I think obviously it's easy to say, oh, we should just do site reliability engineering. But because it's there's a practice, there's a methodology, there's role definition around it, as well as architectural implications, right? That sets the team down a mindset, right? Change, right? Up to and including shifting from a very reactive mode, from incorporating the mindset of how to incorporate quality from the beginning, right? How do we design in so that critical applications are more fault tolerant, right? Because there's a whole different way of engineering, right? At different levels, you can make application logic choices, right? You can make deployment pattern choices about your cloud, and if you use private cloud or public or on-prem. So even on the technical side, it drives a whole different set of downstream discussions that we need to then think about how do we allocate skill to go do that. And the other interesting thing that happens is also, right, it raises good business questions. So it flexes those muscles. Because now if you want to engineer a solution that's much more robust compared to what we've traditionally done, well, there's a cost and a time associated with that, right? It's not free. Like if you think about the childhood kind of parable about the three little pigs, right? Do you want to build a straw house? Do you want to build like a stick house? Or do you want to build a brick house? Right? They don't all cost the same, right? And they certainly take different times, but they'd have different characteristics about their resiliency and fault tolerance and the usability characteristics. Right? And that's an interesting discussion with the business, because normally they're just like, well, just make it right. And sometimes you have to have a bit of the discussion to say, yes, we can make it right, but let's really talk about what right means. Sometimes, and by the way, there's no value judgment in that. It's just a discussion. Sometimes the straw house is okay, right? I just need this for 6 months through the promotion season, and then we'll build it again next year, right? With the learnings of that, and that'll be the brick house for the long term. But for the next year, we'll just do and make do with a straw house.
The awareness of what you're building and why you're building it and how you're building it is very important.
Exactly. And and I think again, as one of the things that I think as a trend has further progressed is really around the business taking a broader interest. Right? And again, last time in our previous discussion, I remember, right, we spoke about, right, the business was already starting to pick up on this several years ago for those leaders who were very acute and more forward thinking, right, where they would take my charts and start explaining like why microservices are interesting and why that's a good thing. And now we've seen that elevate to a different level, right? I think, if we think about how Lenovo is using artificial intelligence, right, it's really gone really broad in the organization now. Right? You can basically walk to any team, right? Whether it's HR, finance, supply chain, product development, services, just anywhere around the company. Right? I can point to a couple of really solid use cases where the teams have picked up on techniques in artificial intelligence broadly to go enhance either the decision making, right, or the efficiency within their domain. And so what we've seen is technology continues to elevate in importance, right? And so even now at the corporate strategy level, kind of broadly speaking, the umbrella term about digital transformation, but really enveloping the automation, the intelligent instrumentation, and deploying AI throughout all aspects of our business that's founded on, right, responsible use of the data that we have, right? That's really taken off, right? And I hear more business teams talking about it, right, and making that a pillar of the strategy, right?
Have you done anything with AI ethics?
AI ethics, I think this one, so because currently where we focused a lot is on the operational side, right? So unlike some of the really large kind of social media companies, right, we tend not to run up against the ethical considerations because a lot of our use cases are for intelligent recommendation, right? Because we're not, in general, given our business model and our configuration, we're tending not to brush up against the political and social issues. Right. So if I pick a couple of examples, right, I'll maybe, and then you can feel free to, you can challenge me on this if you see differently from the various discussions you've had as well. But, for example, we'll think about, how can we, right, a really good one where we use computer vision was to really help out on the quality cycle, right? Because literally before, right, we do things around burn-ins, right? We have to, check for quality issues on screens. And so literally one use case was you have to, because failure modes need to be diagnosed, right? And they're not straightforward. And if you miss it, then you miss it. So instead of having a trained engineer looking at the screen for 8 hours a day to, kind of note the failure modes, right? You can just use computer vision, log the exceptions, right? And then actually save a whole ton of time and make it a whole lot better. Right? Another example, during the pandemic, right? We've really deployed AI to help improve our supply chain end to end, right? We've been supply constrained. I think the semiconductor industry has at this point pretty well documented kind of structural shortages due to the explosion of demand, right? And so we've had to apply more intelligence to create a better experience, whether that's better planning, right? So how do we better forecast planned ship dates? How do we make sure we plot the right logistics for our, in conjunction with our third-party logistics providers so that things can use fewer mileage, right? Or rack up fewer miles on the way to customers. It's greener, it's faster, but it reduces our footprint. But most of our use cases are going to be around really hardcore kind of cost operations and customer experience improvement. And so based on the broader array that we've seen, there hasn't been much on on, again, the things that we might consider the more social aspects, right? Because it just doesn't touch on the sphere of, right, is this a social justice issue or not? I just want to make sure that Joel, you, right, and Modern CTO and our customers can get the best experience when we're provisioning and deploying and getting solutions and equipment to our customers. Does that make sense? But I'm curious to hear, what you think about that.
So I previously thought it was more like the social and justice. Like when I would hear people talk about AI ethics, that's where I was until I had a conversation with the head of AI ethics for Deloitte, and her name is Bina, and she shared with me this like different view of it. Her example was detecting failure rates in like a plane engine, right? And if you're tasked with detecting those failure rates and running your algorithms on it and figuring out, well, it turns out that the way the pilot is driving the plane impacts the engine. And so if they're driving it a little more recklessly or a little harder than other pilots, should that data that they've been able to figure this out, should that data pipe up to, let's say, their review process, like their one-on-one type reviews, and then that would create this interesting ethical uh, question: is should it? And for me, I was thinking, well, I didn't think about that at all from an ethics standpoint. I just see an engine and I need to figure out why it fails, and you know I didn't see that other perspective of it. Another one is like if you're doing a recommendation engine, the famous story with the supermarket, I think it was Target. Uh, they were recommending the birth control, or not birth control, baby products to teenage girls that didn't even know that they were pregnant yet because of their purchase habits and patterns. And so I was just curious, like how the ethics comes up. Like if you have someone, obviously you'll have people, your organization is large enough, you've got smart people who care about this and think about this. But I was just curious if you guys had like an ethics person, or if that's just something that's not coming up a lot.
Yeah, for our use cases, right? I think we definitely have, from our philosophical approach, right? It very much is, right, in terms of responsible use, to have a human in the loop first of all, right? Because I think the first one is we shouldn't assume, right, it's only as good as the data we give it, right? And in general, we know that, right, for many of the decisions, we actually get better results by partnering kind of the outcomes from recommendations with kind of human judgment, right? And or, right, kind of supervised training over time to make sure that there are reasonable outcomes, or we see outcomes if they're skewed, right, on recommendations, for example, um, that we can review them, right? So we have that mechanism where we don't let it's just unsupervised, and it goes on over time, where we train it and forget it and it just keeps going. So I think that's the first point about responsible use of data. And I think, again, because of, I think, the nature of how we engage currently, it's not, we tend not to get to those things that are as sensitive. But you raise a good point, right? To the extent that we instrument our businesses and our interactions more and more so that we can get intelligence about the needs and better serving, right? I think those will increasingly come up, right, to your point. And for us, right, because we're not going to be the firmware that's flying a plane. We haven't gotten to the sensitivity yet where we say, boy, that's really interesting. Because at this point, for example, a lot of our operational decisions are really around kind of the products that you want to buy and how do we drive more efficiency, right? How do we create better? Right. And I think we do have a process so that if there are kind of ethical considerations that come up, right, we do review regularly the use cases and the impacts and how they're being deployed. And so we would surface it that way. Luckily, right, I think we care about it, and that's why we have a human in the loop process, but we haven't really run across very sensitive cases, just given the nature and the profile of AI use cases that we've deployed to date.
Yeah, and your style of business, right? You build a lot of infrastructure, you build a lot of tools, a lot of the lower level stuff. The consultants that are solving some of these problems, like for example with the turbine or the jet engine, you know, there's just different levels of the stack where ethics will come up in different ways.
Yeah. And I think around that, right, to the point about as this gets more and more embedded and we do roll out use cases, it's not to say that it won't happen or we won't have more at Lenovo. But I think, again, there's an opportunity, to your point about what the head of AI ethics at Deloitte was saying. right? I think as part of it is an ethics issue, but part of it is also a long-term, what's our relationship with the data and how do we integrate it in our lives? Because rather than say, well, than taking perhaps a more punitive stance that says, well, you drove the engine too hard and you pushed it 5% above tolerance, so you shortened its lifespan by 20% because it's a nonlinear function. So you get docked on a pay, right? If it's really real time, right? Rather than, we can actually flip it to say, well, if we're getting this data real time, why don't we turn this into a coaching for the pilot, right? Because the pilot's not out to degrade the engine purposely, right? Maybe he's trying to make up time on a flight, right? Maybe he was trained a different way in the simulator, who knows? And so I think the flip side on the opportunity for responsible and positive use to make it the win-win would be really compelling, which is to say, well, forget review time, right? Like after the flight, it's like, hey, these were the things you did. Are you aware you did those, right? And so there can be a review process for the pilot to first think, okay, right, if I did these things, maybe there were wind conditions that required it or something else that happened. And you don't have to wait for review time, but it's something that it's much more, real-time feedback for improving, right? The pilot hopefully improves, and then hopefully the airline and the engine manufacturers also get the benefit with reduced maintenance hours. And that's, I think, philosophically where we've been trying as well. Where we've had the most success has been around finding win-wins, right? Because when we've kind of gone in and we had to learn the lesson the hard way, when the teams felt that it was AI coming to take over their jobs, they would sabotage, literally, right? They would give bad data. They would try to exclude data from the model so we couldn't train up. And so we had worse results, right? But where we found the win-win is to say, look, forget AI, as a thing, right? But look, if we have this new tool for you, if you work with it, you'll have better KPIs and you'll have a better performance score and you'll have a better bonus. And that flipped it entirely. They said, oh, right. And then from there on, right, they actually worked to make it better. And then we actually did see better outcomes. Right. So I know we kind of veered a little bit, but I think that's really kind of the opportunity, right? I do believe, responsible use and ethics are very important. And I think the way we can do that is to be aware of that, human in the loop is likely for the majority of cases to be important. And then as we move to even more real-time and deeper embedding of data and instrumentation in the process, right, we look for those win-wins because I'm confident they're there in almost every use case, right? Whether it's the computer vision, it's automation, right? When you works properly together, people are excited about it, right? And the key is to find those win-wins and not lose sight of the fact that it is another tool. And just as with any other technology, there's going to be guidelines that evolve about responsible use and making sure that we can detect those and tackle those as they come up.
That's been a trend of the conversations I've been having is the using the carrot, not the stick. Everybody that I'm talking to these days is just trying to figure out how to make better work experiences, higher quality of life for everybody, and then how we can use technology to improve our lives, get more freedom, more time with our families, the things we want to do.
Yeah, and it's one is life. Like imagine the engineer, if 50% of your job was staring at a screen with Excel or a notebook, saying, okay, here's the failure mode at like 012 0200, and the next one was 330, right, an hour and a half later, and you've just been looking at a screen. That's a huge quality of life and efficiency improvement, right? And the other level around some of the deployment of AI, right? The reason we've really deployed it around whether it's productivity or profitability around all parts of our value chain is on the people side, on the talent side. I think it's actually a great development tool, right? And people who are embracing it can really fundamentally reimagine what their jobs are like over time, right? If I think about just think about people who are in the call center, right? I think they started with kind of very basic kind of one level scripted AI bots, right? It's like if you match this string, right, this bot will spit you back an answer. If not, right, then it says, sorry, please call an agent. But from that very humble beginning, right, because that's a very basic form of AI, but from that very humble beginning, right, now they've advanced to have kind of multi-level engagement in multiple languages with a much broader knowledge base. And so a team that was originally, well, I just answer phone calls, to then, well, I just kind of create a database to answer robotic issues, is now fundamentally a very different team, right? Because the skills of someone who can answer the phone and read a script, vastly different. And the team themselves they now think of themselves as kind of process engineers and knowledge engineers that are curating the knowledge base, right? Setting up the knowledge graph and the structures, applying, right? Kind of the AI logic to reason across the knowledge base to give answers in an ever expanding and more dynamic way, right? So for them, they're totally in a different space and a career and a capability set than they were when they started. And that's another aspect, right? It's not, it is quality of life. Right? And over time, right, if you really embrace it, it fundamentally helps evolve the nature of your job and what you do and even how you think of yourself, right? Because these people are super excited. They're like, I can go and get a job anywhere. I'm an AI expert, right? Because I can build knowledge graphs, right? I know how to train these models. I know how to use bots, right? And that's such a far cry from I pick up the phone and read a run script.
Did you think we'd be here when you were just a young version of Art winning table tennis championships?
Yeah, well, goes to the nonlinear nature of technology, right? Yeah, I would say I think for many of the use cases, I wouldn't have expected them not knowing beforehand, right? So it's been tremendously gratifying to see it take off and for teams to run with it, right? Because a lot of this wasn't even, and that's I think the beauty of if you set this up properly, it's not even about telling the team exactly what to do, right? It's saying, hey, here's an area of huge opportunity. And over time, they run with it and make it their own, right? So I've been pleasantly surprised and delighted by some of the use cases that the teams have, found occasion to deploy, right? So yes, I would say, you go back 10 years, would not have imagined we would be able to do a lot of the things that we do today, and having now deployed AI much more broadly.
We glossed over that table tennis championship thing way too quick. I have a
We
beard
can take a
now.
quick detour there.
We should, because the beard's new, but I also, our company's growing. We have just under 15 people now here at the podcast, and which means we have awesome researchers and they find all sorts of interesting stuff. And so I was super excited when they said, dude, he's a table tennis champion.
That does feel like a prior life, right?
Right?
This one is more serendipity, but that was I agree. I did grow up in the U.S., right? And so I remember in middle school and high school, people would play tennis, baseball, soccer, right? And I like those things. But my father happened to be a table tennis fan slash fanatic, and so that's where I ended up spending a lot of time. Right? We belonged to a local table tennis club, and I think just following him around, right? He was quite into it. Right? We'd have videos. We would go to tournaments, and so I was very much active on that scene up until basically the middle of high school, I would say. And so it was quite a thing, right? Because it wasn't well understood then, but it was a lot of fun.
What's your thing that you do with your kids?
Yeah, well, I think the pandemic is made it very different, right? Especially with a lot of the team sports. For our kids, I think just in terms of mind and body connection, the baseline is you have to have some physical activity, right? Because if we're sitting at our desk all day, I think that's been physiologically shown to be negative for long-term health outcomes. So with our kids, what we've taken to doing during the pandemic is biking, right? So we got everyone a bike, and then on the weekends we'll find kind of a new biking odyssey and adventure to undertake. Right? So
That's
that's been our
awesome.
preferred mode of getting out and also spending time as a family.
So you load up all the bikes, go explore new trails and new areas.
Yes, exactly. Right. So we get some sun, we get some wind, and we get some exercise. Right? And it's very liberating just to be out of the house sometimes, right? Because you don't realize it until you've spent most of the week sitting in front of conference calls or right in front of for them in classes. Right? And so that's really been a good thing, both physically, but also as time to reconnect as a family.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
got
How
into
about on your
camping.
side? Right? Because it's been a
Camping.
challenge for everyone. Uh-huh.
Yeah, we got a camper and started going to different campgrounds and setting up camp, and it's a lot of physical activity because then you get to walk around the campgrounds, you get to explore new areas. We got to go over to like NASA and camp over there where they're doing some rocket launches. So we've just been exploring.
Well, that's amazing. Is there a kind of a camper ethos or culture that goes along with that?
Oh, it is way, way larger than you could imagine. Like I can't even like right now we were gonna go camping this weekend, but they're all booked up. So there's just no availability. I mean, it's some of the places, like, so there's these dark sky places which are, you can't have white light. It's for, so you can see the Milky Way galaxies, so you can see the stars. So you have to have every, like, red light everything. But some of these campgrounds, to go to them, they're booked up 6 months in advance.
Wow. So that cuts down a little bit on the spontaneity in that case.
Yeah, well, for that specific type of campground, but it depends off on if it's season or not. Also, I live in Florida, and everybody in the world is moving from, like, the Californias and the New Yorks and down to where it's warm and more open, right? So, for example, here the value of my house has gone up significantly, and the average days that a home will be for sale in the market is like a handful, and there's like no availability to rent. The real estate market where I live is just it's chaotic,
Well, it's good that you're in on the ground floor then.
right? There's the bonus, yeah. Because we were gonna sell and move. We were like, look how much the house has gone up. Like, let's sell and then move farther out east or find a rental. But there was nothing, so we're just gonna hang out here for a couple more years.
Were you thinking about moving in state or actually picking up and doing something different for your operations and base?
Yeah, so I'm in the office here. We have like 3,000 or so square foot office. Everybody was here before the pandemic. When the pandemic happened, we were partly leadership software, partly podcast, and we became 100% podcast just because shorter sales cycle and we needed the growth, right? Uh, the changes that happened and occurred in the business, obviously the roles will change, and we ended up hiring people all over the United States, right? Like Nebraska, Chicago, Tennessee. And so as of today, no one's been coming in the office for at least a year. We figured out, we got into a rhythm of how to work fully remotely, and I just come into the office when I have to record the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's nice to have the flexibility, right? Again, I think when confronted with the situation, humans are endlessly creative, right, about how to make
Right.
things work. So
So now we
maybe,
have
because, oh, sorry, go ahead, Joel, please.
so now we have the flexibility. So we went and explored. We went to Texas and we took a plane ride there with two kids under the age of 5, and it was a task. Right. And the people on the plane weren't very happy about it. And it was after that move to Texas, we explored and we decided that we need to go visit multiple places to figure out where we want to relocate. And it would be best if we got a camper and we just drove everywhere, because then we could have everything with us and, drive at night when the kids are sleeping, and then be able to have everything with us along the way. So we haven't, I guess right now we're kind of in a holding pattern. We have a desire to go. We have the flexibility where financially we can, and organizationally we're not tied to this physical location. It's just the app. I'm a big fan of the universe and of God and of timing. And when it all comes together and clicks, that'll be the perfect moment. And I'm just being patient and waiting.
Right. Well, and again, I think we're privileged, and it's great that you're doing well to have that flexibility and that choice.
Yeah. How are you doing with all of this? Are you getting to go into an office, or are you just 100% at home?
Yeah, aside from my trips to China, and when I do go, because they actually have a quarantine period. When I last went in later part of last year, it was 14 days. Now it's 21 days. So at this point, if you want to make a business trip, in order to make it worthwhile, right, you tend to stay for a while. Right? You wouldn't spend 14 days in quarantine and then spend a day and then try to fly home. But aside from that, it has been at home. Right? There's, for us at Lenovo within the US and most of the other parts of the world outside of China, there's no rush back to the office. Right? As you said, I think we really have figured out what fully remote means. Um, but there is a real longing, right, including on my side. When I went back to China last year, I knew I missed the people, but I missed them. How do I say, much more than I would have thought, right? I thought, oh yeah, it'll be nice to see the team again. Right? But when I actually saw them, I was just happy beyond all bounds to actually, share a meal, right, and to share some personal time with the team after so long. Right? And so I think that's been interesting. The flexibility on the work stuff is definitely no issue, right? In terms of task orientation, the technology makes that easy. I can see you, right? I can see what your output is. We can collaborate on some real time. We can talk real time. But at the end of the day, though, even work is not just work, right? There's still kind of a personal and social capital aspect, which isn't quite the same, right? And I saw that because my team has had, right, we've brought people on board, right? And the newer members, it's harder to build those connections when you've been all remote. You just don't have that feel. And as a technologist, it feels weird to say, right? It's very touchy-feely, right? But at the end of the day, that human connection element, I think, does go hand in hand with the technology to make us more effective, right? And I think the long-standing relationships that are built on trust, right, those tend to be strengthened. And it has been, I've noticed, harder to establish newer connections, right, than compared with before when you could actually see people in person. But otherwise, right, I think from a right, otherwise, mentally, right, physically, as long as you get into a rhythm, right, things have been going quite well. It took a while with the pandemic onset to adjust, but now that in this so-called new normal, right, at this point, I'm pretty used to the cadence and the operating rhythm.
So I want to go back. So you go to your. I just want to complete the story because I have this like timeline in my head, and that's why I've got the art who is doing the table tennis with his dad growing up, and then I have Lenovo art. What
Yeah.
happened in the middle?
Yeah, so I grew up on the East Coast, and then for college, I was deciding between some schools on the East Coast and being on the West Coast. And as I remember it, I kind of visited because I'd never really spent significant time in California before. I stepped off the plane, and it was one of those kind of famous California days, right? Spring, right? Blue skies, very moderate, very temperate weather, just sun shining. People are playing like volleyball on the lawns, things like that. And so that convinced me to try something different, right? And that's been a theme. So I came out to California for school. Ended up doing computer science, right, and studied that and graduated. And after there, I took it something different, right? Rather than joining a tech company per se, I went into consulting, right? Again, to try something different. So if there's a theme, uh, you know, trying something different is not a bad idea, right? Because I at that point I joined McKinsey as a consultant, and from there I had the privilege to work in different geographies around the world. I started on the West Coast, but I quickly transferred to Asia to work, right? And so after that I spent the better part of 15 years either in Asia, right, or on the West Coast working. And so I alternated between those locations. It so happened before I joined Lenovo, right, when I was a consultant, they were one of my clients, right? And there came a time when there was some transition, right? There was an opportunity that meshed with the vision of where the company vision and the company need meshed with what I was looking to do, right? Which is really to own something, right? And to really kind of be on the other side, and versus offering advice to actually you know providing my own and then actually executing on that. And so there was the right opportunity towards and I think in 2009 when I joined Lenovo, where that came together, and I decided to make the switch. And at Lenovo, I've had the fortune to rotate through a variety of leadership roles within the IT and technology organization, right, including strategy, right, enterprise architecture, infrastructure, before becoming the CIO several years ago.
I love that. I connect with you deeply on that. I was actually today I was talking with our venture capital fund, and they were asking me like if you sold the podcast or the leadership software, like what would you want or what would you want to do? And so I had to be reflective, right? I didn't even realize I had to be reflective until after I wrote the email and responded to my wife. I said I just had like an accidental moment of reflection about what I really enjoy doing and how I enjoy spending my time. And the key theme of that email was I like when I have responsibility, when I have ownership of an outcome that I need to achieve. Because if I know what the outcome is and I know what my available resources are, it feels good to be able to achieve that. And then I also love working with really, really, really bright people. So figuring out that, you know, the technology could change, everything could change, but I really like owning outcomes and working with brilliant people. Like those are the two things that are requirements for me.
Yeah, and again, if you look at modern CTO, I think it's great, right? You've kind of built up a network of really cutting edge thinkers on a variety of topics, right, from a variety of enterprises, right? So you kind of have this great network, and you can see that accumulate over time, right? And maintaining those relationships and seeing how the world evolves along with them, right? And you kind of are at the front, the leading edge really of, well, I guess management and technology thought, right? And that's super appealing to see what you've built over time bear fruit. And some of the things, right, since we last spoke, right, similarly on seeing the outcomes, right, to have a hand and see the power of technology, right, as part of our business of driving deeper. And right, there have been several, and at this point, Lenovo is over $50 billion, right? So, but
That's
we've
crazy.
had,
That's so
right,
cool.
and directly as a result of some of the things that we've worked with the business on enabling with technology, we have multiple new billion-dollar businesses that are high growth, right? Where I can point to and say that's something that we helped build in the last, in the time since we last spoke 2.5 years ago, right? So similar to you and seeing some of the arc over time, you're saying, boy, right, I helped build that, right? And that's really something to, right, that gives me a tremendous sense of, right, satisfaction.
So we have a hard stop in about 4 minutes, but I've got just a couple product questions for you.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I saw the foldable PC. That was like one of the coolest things I had ever seen. Do you actually? I just 10 minutes before the show I saw it. Is that real? Like, do you have one?
I have one in Beijing. I don't have one
But
here,
they're out.
but
They're
those, yeah,
out. Like you can buy them.
yeah, you can buy them. They are, yeah, they're a lot of fun, right? You can make it a tent mode, right? You can, right? And a part of it's just the novelty, right? As kind of a gearhead, it's just really cool tech, right? It's
Yes.
like I can fold this, but it doesn't break and it doesn't bend and it doesn't show like a fold in the screen afterwards. It's just really neat tech, and so I spent a lot of time playing with it.
So you've got the foldable PCs. I think that's cool. I'm gonna get one now that I know that you can buy them. Uh, the fingerprint. You're doing some stuff with fingerprints. You're doing some projects with Barnes and Noble designing their Nook. You're doing some stuff with the ultralight Chromebooks. What are the interesting parts about those three, or which one would you like to talk about in the last minute or two here?
Well, I think one of the interesting things we'll continue to explore will really be kind of this notion of separating computing, right, from the display. And I think there's been a lot of experiments over the years, but I really think that it's something we can continue to think about. Right, we're at a very interesting time uh, with ARM computing, right? And I think we're probably on the cusp of some computing architecture changes and system on chip and what that means in the next 5 to 10 years. And so I think the space to watch that I think is super interesting will really be around, right? Is there a decoupling of the compute from the display, right? So that your phone can connect to a display, but provide enough processing power so it's pretty seamless, right? And so I think we're continuing to innovate and explore on that front to offer more choice to consumers about how they can have a good computing experience. Because at the end of the day, people don't care what they carry, right? It happens to be a mobile phone today because that's the most convenient. All right, but what if actually you can just take your mobile phone and plug it in, or it's actually even wireless and you can power any display and it kind of seamlessly does whatever you were doing before without thinking about, well, am I on an ARM version of Windows? Am I on Android? Am I on, right? So I think that's something that we continue to look at, which will be interesting. And maybe just quickly, the other thing that we'll look at is around edge computing, right? I think with 5G coming, and this is less in the consumer space, so might be less consumer visible in the near term, but there will be a tidal wave around the Internet of Things as 5G becomes much more broadly deployed. And so I think that's a very fascinating space to watch as well.
Dude, Art, we did it, my friend. We got a hard stop at 2 for you. So I just want to make sure we respect that. It won't be 2 years before we talk again. We're gonna put you on the list for next year. I always super enjoy talking to you. Is there anything that we didn't get out that we wanted to get out for media reasons, or we should go check out Art's interview with Peter High? We're gonna have Peter High on next month, so people should definitely check out your interview over there because it was really fantastic.
Yeah, and Peter's a great guy. Peter's absolutely a wonderful and master interview
Oh
and
yeah.
discussion partner.
Anything else?
Yeah, I think in closing, right, Lenovo has been, fortunate in that and we're the beneficiary of some of the computing industry changes, right, as really demand has shifted to one device per household to one device per person. and not just any device, but a high quality device that you spend a lot of time with. And as a result, right, the demand for services and our shift to offer everything as a service is something that we have been working very hard to reimagine from soup to nuts, from end to end, to provide that experience. And so right, we talked about building billion-dollar businesses, and I think look forward from our transformation roadmap and digital enablement to making everything available for our users and our customers over time with a new modern foundation. And so I think that's really the next wave as well in experience that we're very much looking forward to deliver.